Welcome to Executive Session from Directors and Boards.
You got to be all in. You can't be that old-fashioned board that just, once every quarter sits there and goes, is this happening? Is this happening? Make sure you stay on top of how AI is being integrated, especially in competitors.
Hello, and welcome to Executive Session, the official podcast of Directors and Boards. I'm your host, Bill Hayes, Editor-in-Chief of Directors and Boards. We just heard from Larry Weber, Director of Pega, on AI by Design, his cover story from the latest edition of Directors and Boards. In this episode of Executive Session, we'll also explore why directors fail with Gail Lieberman and leadership under pressure with Al Williams. In boardrooms, relevance is rarely lost overnight. It erodes quietly, often without clear signals or candid feedback. In this conversation with Gail Lieberman, director of Thesys Group and author of the Directors and Boards article, When Directors Fail, Why Some Stay and Others Go, we explore how boards determine when a director is no longer adding value, why operating at the right altitude is more difficult than it sounds, and how effective boards make refreshment more transparent and less surprising. We'll also ask what it really takes for directors to stay relevant as strategy, expectations, and board needs continue to evolve.
Gail, from your experience, how does a board actually decide that a director is no longer adding value? You wrote a piece on this for Directors and Boards, which was just a really great article. But what are the early signals directors should watch for before that judgment hardens, right? That they're no longer, providing that value that people are looking for.
Well, a board's decision that a director is no longer adding value just doesn't happen overnight. It's not that the CEO or the chairman wakes up one morning and says, wait a second, this director isn't adding value, and then action occurs after that. This is a gradual process. And we're not even speaking about the clear-cut case where, for example, the company's direction changes and the kinds of industry experience a board may need is no longer available. Because even then, it's a gradual process. And what happens is that there's this realization that something isn't working. And over time, that subjective view becomes more objective. And, there's really two parts to your question. So I'd like to take both separately and really talk about that shift in perception from that subjective view to the objective view.
Yeah.
So, when there's this realization that something isn't working, what happens, I think, and what I've observed is that perception shifts. There's this initial feeling, and then that starts to become hardened as the more attention is paid to what the director says and does. So, for example, what comments that were once viewed as constructive are now viewed differently, or insightful questions don't seem to be as relevant. And, a third example will be, how when directors kind of respond to a question, they say, I'd like to build on. Well, that build doesn't hit the mark anymore. And so what happens is that, because there's this focus on the director, everything is really seen through that lens. And so the perception changes. And it's funny. I once observed a CEO, I guess he must have had that feeling about someone on the board, when I observed him making little check marks to each director's name anytime that he felt that director said something of value. Now, I don't know what he did with it in the end. I mean, nothing happened, but I kind of observed that behavior. And I was, a little bit taken aback by it. I don't know whether anybody else on the board observed it, but I thought that was kind of interesting. So I think that CEOs and chairmen do pay attention to that. And I think that once that perception and observation starts to take place, you start to see some changes in behavior. First of all, I think it's the CEO that's the primary driver of this. When, even if there's a separation between the chairman and the CEO, I think that it does start from the CEO. I was on one board where, the CEO came to the chairman, who then talked to us on the nominating committee and said, Chairman, the CEO is not happy. And that's when we started the process. But I think also that there's, personal style also comes under that lens. And, now that the director has a microscope on him, not only it's what he says, but how he says it. And then I think that the third thing that starts to come more into focus is how much sponsorship does that director have?
Yeah.
So, you have this, what I call this accumulation, and this accumulation of behavior, communication, it all comes to a head. And that's when a board starts to think about taking action. So now I'd like to switch to signals. What are those early signals?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that one is, of course, that a director finds that their comments are no longer built on.
Yeah.
They may make an observation, they may have something to say, but no one comments. The room just passes over it. I think a second early signal is directors are less involved in informal discussions. A lot of what happens in the board room doesn't take place in the boardroom. It takes place over dinner before. It takes place in phone calls. And I think that if you're not involved in that process, that you kind of get a sense that something isn't working.
Yeah.
And I think that any feedback that you might get, even if you ask at those early stages, it's not specific. It's polite more than anything. And I think that it's kind of a personal thing because, people do have gut feels about things. I think that you feel that you feel slightly out of sync and that the room is shifting.
Yeah.
And you can't really be specific about it, but there's a feeling that you get that something isn't quite right. And it really comes to the forefront if another director starts to really have valuable contributions and you see that those valuable contributions are being taken up by the board, whereas, your input becomes less.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the last thing you want when you say something in a meeting, I would imagine, is to just basically hear crickets and people are moving on to the next thing. So yeah. Absolutely. And you write that directors often fail by operating at what you call the wrong altitude. So how can directors self-check whether they're staying at the governance level, right? So testing strategy rather than drifting into management or tactical oversight.
Well, I think it's important also to define what we mean by altitude, because, you've heard the saying, noses in, fingers out. I maintain that isn't enough. I mean, we all know what that means in terms of, what are the right questions to ask, how to present yourself in terms of adding value. But it really isn't enough because you have to be at the right level of contribution. That's really what altitude means. It's noses in, fingers out, plus contributing at the right level. So I think that, and by the right level, I mean, your insight has to be adopted. You may have a wonderful remark and, if nothing happens, if it doesn't land, then is that really of value? So I think the best way to think about this is, let's take some examples about what the right altitude level looks like and what the wrong altitude level looks like. I think maybe that would be helpful. So certainly the right altitude is being future focused. And that means you want to talk about future risks and future opportunities and the competitive dynamics, as opposed to being talk about the historical history of the company. I think the second is framing and judgment, that you help the board think about trade-offs and second and third order consequences.
Yeah.
And I think the third is that you're changing the discussion. You're not just extending it. You can't be the person who just says, I'd like to build on what that other director said. You really have to be able to change the discussion. And so when you think about what the wrong altitude looks like, as you mentioned, it's getting sucked into operations discussions as opposed to staying at that strategic level. And it's, always bringing up your own context and the past as a way of framing your question. I don't think that that's really helpful. And the third, interestingly enough, is being overcritical of management and not really giving them the credit for all the hard work that they have done. I mean, I think that most companies, just to even prepare for board meetings and to prepare the pre-reads and the board book, they spend weeks on that.
Yeah.
And so the last thing they want, is to come into a meeting and then be criticized without being given any credit.
Very interesting. And I think one of the interesting notes that you have in there, especially, is this idea that it's not just a discussion. It's a discussion that has to lead to concrete steps, right? You're not just in there just to talk. The things that you're saying need to come to things that management gets out of it and strategies. So that's a very interesting perspective. Boards increasingly rely on evaluations and refreshment processes, yet many exits still come to a surprise. They're a surprise to the departing director, right? So what does an effective board do differently to make feedback clearer and refreshment more credible and less opaque? You talked about this a little bit earlier, right? It shouldn't be a surprise.
But we're all human, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And because we're human, unless we're actually told directly about something, we tend to think more positively than perhaps more subtly. And I think that that is part of the problem. When boards are indirect and you don't get ongoing feedback, because of that, you think that everything's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, boards themselves are very collegial. They're reluctant to really give, hard feedback, even though it's meant constructively. And while it's understandable, it creates a lot of ambiguity. And so, I think that what boards can do is they can make their evaluations of director ongoing and specific. And they can focus on what will actually make this director more valuable to us. Maybe they went through all that trouble of choosing that director in the first place. And unless you're talking about something that's really hard and fast, like we mentioned earlier, a company is just taking completely different direction strategically in a completely different industry. And you really need to swap out someone who is more of a generalist for someone who has very specific knowledge, because that industry is so wide. I'm thinking healthcare, for example. Yeah. If you have a director on the board and you're moving your business totally into that area, and that director was more of a manufacturing executive, that's pretty clear cut, and it's something that is understandable to a director, but it can be explained to him in a way that, or her, in a way that actually makes sense. And I think as a second, which leads really to my second point, that refreshment should be part of the DNA of the board. It shouldn't be a surprise that any director leaves. I know myself, I was on a board for 5 years, and the question was, shall one renew for another 5 years? It happened to be their term. And I happened to move out of the area, so I really couldn't have served for the additional 5 years, but I was really struggling with whether I should actually renew because I wasn't learning anything new and I didn't feel I was contributing anything new.
Yeah.
Now, you know, as it turned out, that company was doing lots of different things, but that didn't happen until 5 years, even after I was on that board. So now I could look at it and say, okay, now I could contribute. But I think that there is this idea that if refreshment is part of the DNA of a board, then directors expect that after a certain amount of time, that it would be okay to transition off that board. And that's why good structure like term limits and annual renewal, where it actually gives you discipline to have that conversation, is probably a very positive thing. And boards that do that on an ongoing basis have directors who leave who aren't surprised. They're comfortable with that because, look, once you're part of a board, especially for 5 or 10 years, I mean, it's like being in a work environment for that period of time. It becomes incorporated into part of your life's experiences, and you've made friends and you have relationships. And I think that everyone wants to respect that.
That was Gail Lieberman. Next up, we'll speak with Larry Weber. AI is moving quickly inside organizations, but speed without intention can create as much risk as opportunity. In this discussion with Larry Weber, director of Pega and author of AI by Design, Not by Default, What Boards Must Know, in the latest edition of Directors and Boards, we examine how boards can tell whether AI is being adopted strategically, how to embed its oversight into enterprise risk frameworks, and what meaningful guardrails look like in practice. We'll also explore how directors can ensure that, even as AI shapes critical decisions, accountability and human judgment remain firmly in place.
So, Larry, your article for Directors and Boards argues that companies should adopt AI by design, not by default. From a board perspective, what signals tell you that AI adoption is happening intentionally as part of strategy rather than emerging piecemeal across the organization?
Yeah, good question. The first thing I would tell boards, like I've told mine, is let's make sure we're all on the same page of what AI we are using at the company and what strategy have we employed for those types of AI. As you know, AI is sort of like a layer cake. It's sort of at the base foundation. It's the ChatGPTs. It's what I call sort of extension of search. And then it goes all the way up to agentic integration, which is where you have the bots that are going out and actually representing the company to a variety of different audiences and coming back and, reporting back. So, and all in between. So you have to at least really understand what flavors of AI are being embedded in the strategy of the company. Then you have to really start to look at all the touch points that AI is affecting. And I start with, I think customers are the most important. And often boards forget that they have to stay close to customers too. And AI is really good at enhancing experiences. So especially digital experiences. So being able to use, an integrated agentic combination of AI, maybe based on Claude, seems to be the hot, large language model right now from Anthropic. But it really helps you create experiences that are help in a sales process, help in a service process. And so you'll start to see as a board a more happy connection to your customers and potential customers. I also think you should start seeing advances in product development that you might not have seen, because what AI, as part of an innovation strategy, can go out and really explore what you might be missing in some of the product development that is occurring in the company. So I think you have to keep an eye on how the products have evolved and how they've reacted to strategic direction with the use of AI. I think more effective sales process is a third point. I think, really seeing that your sales is faster, it's more informed. I think that that's important to ask your head of sales, your CEO, anybody involved in the sales process. Are we, I often say, even before we started implementing AI, business today really comes down to quality and speed.
Yeah.
So, and really the AI tools are all about speed. We have to manage the quality and make sure we have the right data sources. But that shouldn't be a board. They should just be aware of that and make sure that the executives at the company are dealing with that. I think the exploration of innovation through the use of AI is another key telltale of using it properly, so that you don't have to invent everything at a company, right? And the board should be like that. They should be like, well, what innovations out there that we can plug in? What are we missing? And so in a way, that's advanced search too, but boards should notice if that's being used and where that's going. Also, this might be a controversial thing to say, but the last thing I would say is hiring should slow down if you're using AI strategically, because it should be replacing some of the basic research, data analytics, things that were, done by maybe more junior employees, but that your more senior employees are using it to move faster and not having to just delegate, simple tasks to people, where you can delegate it to agents and that. And the last bit I would say to a board is you got to be all in. You can't be that old-fashioned board that just, once every quarter sits there and goes, is this happening? Is this happening? Make sure you stay on top of how AI is being integrated, especially in competitors, in other businesses that you might be following, and keep reading about it. I think the journal, along with your publication, have been very good at going deeper on the use of strategic AI applications. So those are a few things, Bill.
It's interesting. I love the analogy of the AI as layer cake. In my own work, I'm sort of at the bottom layer still right now, but who knows? We might be working our way up towards the top at some point.
Well, people like icing the best, right? So
That's right. That's the best part of any cake. But AI introduces risks around bias, transparency, data privacy, and regulatory exposure. How should boards integrate AI oversight into their existing enterprise risk frameworks rather than treating it as sort of a standalone technology issue?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's going to be difficult for the way boards are set up right now with the different committees we have. Where do you put integrating technologies, especially advanced AI technologies, in governance? And it's an important question. Is it in the governance area? Probably. You probably should have a technology governance subcommittee. Might be an idea that you think about that includes maybe someone reporting that's a chief ethics officer or chief technology guardrail, somebody that's there that really understands the integration of technologies, not just AI, but all of them, and that they're being used properly. So I think it's a governance issue around that. Some people have mentioned that maybe it goes to cybersecurity, but I don't think it's that type of a threat. That's a whole different ball of issues and has its own concerns as cybersecurity is more of a threat. This is actually a more, how should this be used in a more ethical and powerful way? And I think that that's where we might look at. I think Salesforce was one of the first companies to have a chief ethics officer. IBM put their top lawyer on the ethical use of software and AI applications, including quantum, and they're a leader in quantum. So you're starting to see a lot of movement toward this management of innovation, this management of technology, assuring that it's strategically used and properly used. You also can put rules in there. You know, that's the other good thing. The good software coders at a company, or if you outsource it, should be able to put restrictions on the use of certain AIs, and that should be done as you go over them, much like you manage employees. You know, you should be managing these agents or these bots, you know, and other AI applications. So it becomes a management issue, just like you had a chief talent officer managing people, you know.
Right. So your piece, which I should say is it's the lead story in the Directors on Boards AI edition. We have some really great stuff in there, so thank you so much for that. But
Sure, enjoyed it.
the piece, it suggests that AI guardrails should not only constrain risk, but also enable disciplined innovation, right? As you talked about a little bit there. What does an effective set of board level guardrails look like in practice?
Well, I think what it looks like is you actually almost have dogmatic rules that have to be written down. And you can even ask and use the AI, what are the best guardrail practices that boards can have? And you'll get, you know, a dozen that should be discussed openly at a board meeting, you know, and you need to give it a responsibility. The CEO needs to be involved, but it's probably more a chief operations officer, you know, somebody that is involved in applying technology to your product development, to your customer experience, to whatever you're using for it. Because every company, I believe, even if you make potato chips, is a technology company.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that it's at the board level that you have to set parameters, rules of engagement, of how you use this. You also can ask the actual companies. I think Anthropic's done a very good job at suggesting guardrails and principles for proper use of large language models. I think Microsoft has done a good job around Copilot and how to use that, you know, in a more senior executive and board level operations. So I would suggest looking at those too. And I wouldn't leave it to an outside consultant. I would have maybe someone on the board in charge of really looking at this and bringing it to the governance committee or into the day-to-day management teams of what they're doing. So
that was Larry Weber. Now to our final discussion with Al Williams. In high-pressure moments, boards are often called to judge not just decisions, but the discipline behind them. In this conversation with Al Williams, director of Hancock Whitney Corporation and author of the Directors and Boards article, Calm, a framework for leadership under pressure, we explore how directors can assess whether leadership is truly prepared for a crisis, how to separate signal from noise in fast-moving situations, and how to ensure decisive action without drifting into short-term reactivity. So, Al, your article for Directors and Boards argues that calm under pressure is not a personality trait, but a discipline leader's practice. From a board's perspective, how can directors evaluate whether a CEO or leadership team actually has that discipline before a real crisis tests it?
Bill, as I said in the article, you know, calm is a state of being, and probably just to set the table, you almost can think of calm as being exactly the opposite of chaos. You think about those two type of extreme, and really what you're trying to achieve is really a structured way to think, decide, and act.
Yeah.
As they go through, applying the methodology that I shared in the article. And really what I'm trying to get to is when I talk about that, it is about centering yourself, assessing the situation, leading deliberately, and moving with purpose. Those things lead you to a very structured way to how to methodically work through whatever the pressures are, whatever the crisis may be at any given time. And so when you think about that's what you're trying to get your leadership to do, well, what the board can do to assist them in this area, as they're thinking about, hey, do they have this level of discipline? Is really thinking about engaging with the CEO to really discuss and understand, hey, what are those key business risks that are known around your business?
Mm.
The reason why you want to start there is because you can have an example. Those things could be operational, they could be financial. You can have things that people know is like cyber. It's a threat to your business, along with reputational. And the reason why you want to engage the CEO is really then to be able to think through, hey, what is your thought process for how are we managing and mitigating that potential risk? So it's back to, you want to be able to help and engage the leader to make his thinking visible and how he's going to go about approaching those things. How would they go about being very deliberate in making decisions? And then the actions they will take. You got actions that are taking to try to prevent an incident from occurring, and then you got the actions you would take in case of an incident would occur. And having that dialogue before an incident occurs is really where the board gets a chance to get a view into management's thinking and their logic and their methodology to addressing issues. And because this is very important, that's around, hey, how do you become practiced and proficient at understanding the risk and then being very thoughtful and deliberate in how you're going to manage and mitigate that risk.
Interesting. And so as you broke down a little there for the folks, and as they'll see when they look at your article on directorsandboards.com, CALM here is a framework, right? And one of the steps in that framework is assess the situation. That's the A in CALM here. It includes separating real risks from noise and identifying what decisions are reversible versus material. In the boardroom, what questions should directors ask management to help clarify that distinction during what's going to be a fast-moving situation?
Oh, absolutely. You have those things occurring, you could say almost daily. They don't necessarily always rise to the level that requires the board to be involved. But when they do, the things that I found helpful to me and in my dialogues when I was in one of those executive roles and engaging with the board, and that I find even now when I'm in a board capacity, is really, let's first make sure we understand the context of the issue and the magnitude of it. So some of the questions the board can be asking is really, one is understanding, hey, what area of our business is this impacting? And what is not only the current impact, but what's the potential scale of the impact and for how long? So you want to understand the order of magnitude. And the other question that a board would ask that will follow up to that is really getting a sense for, hey, is this something that you, the management team, have direct control over in regards to how you respond and addressing it? Or is it something that may require government involvement or third-party services? Because the nature of the issue that a company may have to deal with may not necessarily be all within their control. So that's the other element that you're calibrating to get a sense of how deliberate the board can be, or to what level they may have to partner with other stakeholders to actually address whatever the issue is at that time. And third, it really is a case of understanding what is the potential impact to the company's reputation and its shareholders. Because as a board, you're trying to make sure you understand what's the potential impact to your shareholders' interest, given the nature of the issue. And you want to get a sense of that sooner rather than later. And then the board can really play a role in truly now leveraging the expertise that board have. Most boards are quite diverse. Most of the boards have people who've had lived experiences in dealing with crises and others. And that then allows the CEO to be able to tap into various board members who may have dealt with similar challenges, or the board members able to point to additional resources that the CEO and the leadership may not be aware of that can help them to be able to address that challenge.
Interesting. As you said earlier, and as I pointed to a degree, one of these are fast moving issues. So one of the things that jumped out to me when reading the article is this idea that calm leadership doesn't necessarily have to mean slow leadership. In fact, it can't when you have to move that fast. So once direction is set, leaders, they have to move with purpose, which I believe is the M in calm, right?
Yes.
How can boards ensure management is acting decisively during a disruption without pushing the organization into what could be a reactive sort of short-term way of decision making?
What I would, in looking at this particular area, moving with purpose, I think the opportunity for the board here is really be a source of calm for its CEO and the leadership team. And what I mean by that is really, as they're engaging with the leadership team, ensuring that they are relying on discipline in their approach versus adrenaline and how they are addressing that issue. So the board, and this is where we sometimes find ourselves having to make sure that we don't get pulled into wanting to be the crisis management team, because all of us have been in that CEO's or the executive's role before. So you have to be very cognitive of you're wearing a different hat.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that you perform the board role and not try to perform the leadership role when you're dealing with the crisis. And part of the way that you could be helpful in ensuring that they continue to move, being very deliberate and being able to make sure that they're moving with pace is really, providing them the support they need. And this really gets around to understanding what the crisis is and making sure that the CEO has truly thought out what are the clear objectives that they want to be trying to achieve in addressing this particular crisis. For example, if you got a operational plant at one of your facilities, there was a significant safety incident. What would the company be trying to do? And is that your largest facility that generates the most revenues for your companies? Being clear on what are going to be your objectives as you face that incident. So you can imagine for the people on the ground, their focus is going to be around, hey, let's make sure that we, the safety of all of our personnel. We're going to make sure that we contain the incident. And then subsequently, you want to get to the point of now beginning to look at now, how do you stabilize your operations around that particular incident before you look at, learning what caused it and then potentially putting your facility back into service. Well, as a board, you have to be very mindful of the tactical things that are having to be taking place during that instance versus the bigger things that you could be helpful with the CEO on, because you got people on the ground handling the tactical. Then you have to widen your aperture to make sure that we think about what are the potential reputational issues, what things that is it contained within that perimeter fence of your facilities, or is there community impact? And this is where you want to make sure your CEO is continuing to maintain a macro perspective around those incidents, because there are other external factors that can come into play, and the board can be a partner with them, making sure they're thinking ahead around these other things that we have to be able to manage and maintain a level of business continuity at the same time to try to mitigate the overall impact that particular incident may have.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much to Al Williams, Larry Weber, and Gail Lieberman. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Executive Session. Please look out for our next episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with your friends and colleagues and let them know they can look for it on the Directors and Boards website. Also, make sure to check out directorsandboards.com, where you can get all of the articles from our magazine, as well as so much more. You might also be interested in our weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to at our website. And when you visit the site, make sure to check out all of our back episodes of Executive Session, which are also available wherever you get podcasts and on our new YouTube channel. So once again, I'm your host, Bill Hayes, and until next time, consider this executive session closed.